I'm excellent. Thank you. How are you, John?
Uh, yeah, I'm great. I'm great. Just another day in Bitcoin land.
Yeah.
75 basis points from the Fed as expected.
Yeah.
Everything unfolding as it should. So,
Yeah.
just another day.
Exactly as predicted.
Yeah. So, set out tweeted out a tweet a little while back, and as I often do, and just say like, who wants to jump on for a conversation? And you said that you been working as a CPA for most of your career, right?
I'm a CFP, a certified financial
Oh,
planner.
sorry.
Yeah. No,
Cool.
it's a similar sort of designation, but it's really for people working in the retirement planning arena and investment management.
Right. And
Yeah.
I see your shirt. I like it. I like it.
Yeah. Thank
Some
you.
Bitcoiner swag.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you said that, you could talk about Bitcoin a little bit through that lens. And you also hinted that, perhaps like me, you think Bitcoin might be more than just a monetary upgrade. So,
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know where you want to get
Absolutely.
it kicked off today, but I'll let you decide.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess part of what might be interesting about my perspective is just I've been in the legacy financial world for 25 plus years. I worked through, the dot-com crash and the great financial crisis. I've sat through hundreds or thousands of different meetings from institutional money managers, separate account managers, and just really immersed in the whole Wall Street, mentality. And it always struck me as, maybe more than slightly disingenuous. Everybody's, and this is not going to be surprising to anybody, but
Right.
everybody's always talking their book, and everybody's perspective, it gets cut off at a certain point.
How fitting. See if we can get Josh back while I pull off a piece of hanging skin. You back?
Yeah, sorry about that. My phone is on do not disturb now, so we shouldn't get interrupted again.
That was perfect. You were like, you get cut off and then you dropped immediately. So continue.
Yeah, so there's a lot of smart people working in legacy finance, but their thinking only extends so far. There's a lot of realities in our economic world that they don't want to entertain, and so
They're
you
not
have a lot of
incentivized
bright.
to entertain either, like it's not just that they
Absolutely.
don't have the interest. You get in that machine and it's like, hey, stop thinking about like the collapse and the faults of the fiat system and all that shit. Sell the
Yeah.
insurance, sell the products, sell the mutual funds, do whatever, increase the value of your book, bring in the commissions, and it's like, well, why am I going to spend time, talking about the fucking monetary system?
Yeah. And again, this is not, groundbreaking information, but it's just, everybody has to invest. It's a necessary evil. And as an advisor, you build, really close relationships with your clients. A lot of your clients look and feel like your parents, and you're trying to help them. You're trying to manage, their long-term financial plan. And you want to be open and sincere with them, but it's, within the legacy financial system, it's really difficult. And I think, if you just ask simple questions like, what happens if we have to print more money to solve every economic problem in ever increasing amounts for the foreseeable future? How does that all play out? You can't really ask that question, and there are no answers. So it's just a conversation that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So there's just this level of insincerity, or a lack of curiosity about this that's it's pretty profound. And even even in the legacy financial system, most advisors don't even invest in gold, which kind of goes to show you too that nobody wants to entertain the idea that anything other than stocks are what you should be holding for the long term.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, this varies slightly based on the firm, the industry, the product, and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, gold in most cases doesn't pay like a great commission, like if you're getting involved
Yeah.
in a fund or, whatever the circumstance is. And so that is just indicative of the incentives of the existing financial system being way off, right? So like,
Yeah.
are you exclusively doing what's in the best interest of your clients? And I like, because I worked in the industry for 2 or 3 years, very briefly, but enough to see kind of how it works. And it's like, not really, like you go
Yeah.
in maybe with that intention, but then it gets narrowed down, right? It gets narrowed into the particular aspect of the financial industry you're in, and then it gets narrowed down even further into the particular firm you're in, and the
Yeah.
the
Asset class.
the asset classes, the arrangements they have with certain asset providers they're working with, and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And it gets narrowed down and narrowed down until like now you're sitting in front of someone and you're saying, hey, I'm the guy that you go to like sort out your future, to make sure that you can actualize the life that you want, to make sure that you can insulate yourself from the chaos and the pitfalls that exist in the system. But
Yeah.
instead of looking at a huge whiteboard and being like, this is how we're going to do it, and this is my perspective on thing, it goes shoop, it goes
Yeah.
here. And it's like, well, do you want this thing, that thing, this thing, or that thing? And again,
Yeah.
like the incentives are screwed off because you're tasked with making a decision like, well, should I do what's most financially advantageous for me, most financially advantageous for them? How do I find the balance between the two? And it's just,
Yeah.
it's all kind of a shit show. And you say like, and I think you're right, like in this existing system, people do need to be investors
Yeah.
because you have to go out on the risk spectrum just to maintain the value of your capital, of your savings. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's how it should be. And in certain times in the past, it wasn't. Like you could go out on the risk curve if you wanted to, well, take more risk and potentially gain more reward, but wasn't a necessity, right? Like you
Yeah.
could work, you could save, and that would be sufficient to have a nice, comfortable life. And if you were just a humble saver for your whole life, you'd probably end up okay. You'd be able to, put your kids through school or support them in whatever way you wanted. And you would never have to risk losing a tremendous amount of your wealth. But now, as a result of the fiat system that we're in, of course, you don't have that option. If the monetary basic, if true inflation is like 10, 15, whatever plus a year, well, you got to go way out on the risk spectrum to even preserve your
Absolutely.
capital. And
Yeah.
I just think that's such a perversion of the way it's supposed to be, where if you want to just work and save, that should be sufficient to live, a comfortable,
Absolutely.
safe life. And of course, I think with Bitcoin, we're going to get that. And I think the investing industry will probably shrink dramatically as a result. Not entirely, because again, people are
Yeah.
going to want to take more risk. But I think a lot of people, because many people have talked about this in the Bitcoin space, but as you get this circumstance with fiat money, and as it gets even more egregious over time, you get all manner of risk taking being exacerbated. So it's, out on the risk spectrum in terms of investments, more gambling. We see it in, with crypto, generally speaking. I mean,
Yeah.
it arrived at a time, and part of the reason why it blew up so much is because it facilitates that. And then you have online betting, online poker, sports betting, like all this stuff gets blown out larger than it probably otherwise would be, because there's such a strong incentive to try to preserve capital, even though in most people's minds they're thinking about expanding capital. But I think there's an underlying impulse that they're feeling that if they don't do that, their capital is actually diminishing, even not in nominal terms, but in real terms.
Yeah. Well, and they're absolutely right. I mean, a lot of what I do with clients is financial planning, and financial planning is always, it's a work in progress. It's never, you can run a plan and it says you're good to go. You run the plan 12 months later and it could give you totally different results. And especially right now, I mean, I have clients who have done a great job saving. Maybe they have $3 or $4 million saved. They're in their 60s. They're, thinking they'll live into their 90s. and maybe spending $6,000-7,000 a month, relatively modest spending goals. And their financial plan last year looked great. 2% inflation. Your financial plan looks very sustainable. You run that plan now at 7 or 8%, and there's virtually no chance that they're going to have that money into their 90s. When you compound those inflation rates year over year, you have, like you said, you have to go way out on the risk spectrum, and you have to take more and more risk. And it's a very difficult job. I mean, even with professional help, it's difficult, with the increasing volatility of the marketplace and the tendency for the market to move in the direction of max pain. The market fools the majority of people the majority of the time, advisors included. It's just a very difficult proposition. And you put that on top of, people are working as hard as they can just to, keep their life going and save as much as they can. Now they have to take on this whole separate job to manage the money that they've saved. It's a completely unreasonable expectation.
Yeah. And an expense, obviously, to hire someone to do it and, all that kind of stuff. So
yeah. And advisors always make money. I mean, they're the one consistent, in terms of their revenue is always coming in. Now their performance might not be great, and their, the net to the client might not be amazing, but the advisors are getting paid. So it's a necessary evil in a lot of ways. You can't not invest, or at least historically that has been the case. I mean, now that there's Bitcoin, you can opt out and you have a much better solution. But historically, Bitcoin hasn't been there, and you had to play this game, which is a game that's really easy to lose at, for sure.
Totally. And it's not just the added risk and the risk of loss, but like, as you mentioned, as people get pushed out on the risk spectrum, you get this introduction of vastly more volatility in all of these things as people are moving around and trying to figure out how to weather, all of the risk, how to manage all the risk and how to mitigate the loss. And, there's a very real, and I think a lot of people that are involved with Bitcoin are starting to appreciate the quote unquote Bitcoin Zen sort of component of things. Like there's a very real psychological cost to all this too, right? Because even if you do have a nice little nest egg of, $3 or $4 million, let's say, and it's growing at 8 to 12% a year, and you're relatively happy with that. And even with inflation, like, maybe it's being preserved, even just like the mental cost of knowing that your wealth has shot up by 50% and come down by 70% or all that kind of stuff. Like it's just another thing. And wealth is such a visceral thing, right? Because it literally represents what you're able to do out in the world, how much of the world you're able to gain access to. And so when you see it bouncing around like that, like that's registering as my potential is this. Now my potential is this. Now my potential is this. Now my potential is this. And it's kind of a mind fuck, right? Because like, it's toying with what you're capable of doing. Whereas, when you have something that you can have confidence in you're saving in, then that is far more like stable. And I think that engenders a stability psychologically as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Having that faith. I mean, I've sat with so many different successful clients, doctors and attorneys who have large amounts of money saved but are invested in stocks and bonds and don't really even have a fundamental understanding of what they're invested in. I mean, I think that's kind of normal. Most people, and maybe even to some degree, the financial markets, they are the way they are because the banks don't want people to understand, what's going on. They would love it if people just give them their money and let them invest. But it's a very difficult thing to wrap your mind around. And most people can't, it's too opaque at the end of the day. And so you're happy when it goes up, but you don't really understand why it's going up or why it's going down. And it's another level of stress in your life and uncertainty that's that you, like you said, it's just such an important component of your safety and stability for you and your family long term, that it puts everybody in a difficult situation for sure.
Yeah, and you try to shift that stress and uncertainty to someone like yourself, right? Because they're like, look, I don't have the time, I don't have the expertise, so like I don't want this to be a concern for me. I got other concerns that are more deserving of my time, or at least I'm more capable of managing. So I'm going to shift that off to somebody else. And that introduces a bunch of things. That introduces elements of trust. That introduces, well, someone having agency over your wealth, and maybe they would make different decisions than you. But you kind of, as you say, the system forces you to do that. And when you were saying that, it makes me think of that famous Henry Ford quote that if the people knew how the banking system worked, there'd be riots in the streets like by morning or something like that, or before morning. And but even, one of the kickers here is that even when you kind of, first of all, most people don't want to hear it because it's irrelevant to their life. It's like, oh, that's wonderful. The whole monetary system is completely fraudulent. What am I going to do about it? Like, I still got to wake up in the morning and go to my clinic and see the patients or represent the people or whatever it is. Like, why the fuck do I care? And fair enough, because that's true. Like, if you can't do anything about it and you got other concerns, then why is it relevant at all? And the answer is it's not relevant, really.
No. Yeah.
And that's part of the problem, right? That people are put in this position where even something that they might like explicitly agree is fraudulent or unfair or unjust or whatever word you want to use for it.
Yeah.
And they can't do anything about it. And exploring once again how this system has a psychological impact or an impact on the psyche. It's like, how does that influence you? How does that condition you when you come to understand that something that is being done to you that is wrong and is being done to everybody on a massive scale, but you can't do anything about it, nor do you have the means or time or capacity to do anything about it? Like, what signal are you sending to yourself when you accept that sort of a position on things? You're accepting it's certainly kind of defeatist, right? It's certainly kind of
completely,
like it's not good, right? You don't want to be sending yourself that signal. You want to be existing in a world where you agree with the fundamental tenets or institutions of the society you're in, right? Like you believe they're virtuous and they're right and they're just. And I think this is part of the reason why the fiat system cultivates and inculcates this sense of unfairness and injustice that many people feel and express in many unproductive or destructive ways, is because they like this is bubbling up more and more all the time. Like the fundamental injustice of the base layer of the system, which I think we might agree is the money, is increasingly bubbling up through all the different manifestations and institutions of the society. And people are feeling that, if not explicitly recognizing it for what it is. And then they're responding to it, right? And they're responding to it in what would probably be, laying it out like this, fairly predictable ways, with substance abuse or with, mental health issues or with destructive habits, all that kind of stuff. Like it, again, not the exclusive reason, but you can easily see a line between the two.
How it feeds in. Absolutely. I mean, you walk away from your meeting with your financial advisor feeling like you're incapable of understanding the big picture. You don't understand why, you feel incapable of managing your own finances. And then you're going to take that negative feeling into the rest of your life and in every other, endeavor you might take on, at least to some degree, just a feeling of inadequacy. I think that's pretty common. And I think a lot of people end up sort of disassociating from it a little bit. They sort of have this, the markets do whatever they do. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to spend too much time thinking about it. I got a guy, he's hopefully taking care of it, but that's not really congruent with the amount of time and effort they put into saving the money. I mean, you do everything you can to make sure that you have the best job you can, that you're managing your budget and you're saving as much money as you can. And then when it comes to the critical component of tending to that savings, you end up a little bit like, oh, that's just something that happens and I can't control it. And so whatever, a lack of control and a lack of ability to manage that situation is, not a great mindset to have in general.
Totally. I mean, I've always thought it was, funny is not the right word, maybe sad is the word or something in between, but how like someone could, and myself included, because we're all kind of subject to this, but you can work so hard day in and day out for whatever your keep is, right? Whatever you're earning and whatever you're able to save, and you build it up and you build it up and you make a financial investment decision, whatever it might be, and it doesn't pan out, or you were scammed or bad timing or whatever, and you lose like what is equivalent to like 5 years of savings. And it's just like, oh, well, that sucks. And it's like,
Yeah.
fuck, really? That
Yeah.
sucks. Like that's 5 fucking years of your life, like
Yeah.
waking up every morning, feeding yourself, going to work, going to the grocery
Yeah.
store, cooking dinner, blah, blah, blah. 5 years. And then poof, like that, it can be gone. And
Yeah.
I mean, what can you do other, because you don't want to just like snap and, lose your shit. So you're just like, oh, well, it's the nature of the beast. And
Yeah.
again, like being even in an environment where that's possible, I think puts a tremendous psychological burden on people, which is why, again, like I think it's so important that one of the benefits of Bitcoin one of the benefits it's going to bring back to society is like, if you so choose, just to have that ironclad stability of I work, I save, I work, I save, and I'm not even putting myself in the position where it can go poof and I'm talking about like, first of all, in kind of a hyper Bitcoinized world where we don't see the volatility, but more importantly, I'm
Yeah.
talking about your nominal amount of Bitcoin and not its USD exchange rate, because I think that's the better way to look at it. But you can just accrue, and you're never putting yourself in a position where 5 years can go up in smoke in a second because you made the wrong decision, or your guy made the wrong decision, or something happened to the markets, or
Just bad
your
timing.
custodian. Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
I think that will influence people as a form of conditioning or a form of like psychological signal quite differently than we have today. And that will be a very positive benefit in helping to keep people or allow people to access a greater kind of sense of peace and calmness with which then to think about all the other things they're doing in their life and where they want to direct their energy and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And the confidence of knowing that you're invested in something that can't be diluted or confiscated, or all the other things that we invest in Bitcoin for. It's a huge peace of mind component, because you can, like you said, you can do everything right and just be a victim of poor timing. I mean, that's kind of what markets do. They suck people in at the top and they spit them out at the bottom.
Totally.
I'm 51, and my first introduction to investing was in the late 90s, just before the dot-com bust. Just in time to start saving money and plowing money into the stock market, just to see it get eviscerated. And then you lick your wounds for a couple of years. You finally get confident to get back in the market. A couple of years later, you ride it up into 2007, 2008, where the whole thing happens all over again. Mm-hmm. And it leaves scars for sure.
Yeah. And you're forced into it because you can't not engage in that. Because if you decide, well, I'm not going to engage, well, okay, well, then I have the melting ice cube that I have to deal with. And what am I going to do about that? Like, do I take the 10% hit on the chin every year, or do I try to mitigate it to some degree? And then you get sucked into that world where you're trying to mitigate it. And then you're at the behest of all the crazy shit that happens, as you say, so, and I think also I think Bitcoiners are beginning to appreciate just how profound the psychological effects are of having that absolute integrated at the kind of epicenter of their at least interpersonal, let's say, life vis-a-vis money, because so much of things in today, by virtue of the fact that people are so busy that they have to kind of go faster on the hamster wheel to get by, that they've been conditioned to delegate or abdicate responsibility or authority for certain things. So like, all right, you decide what's good for me financially. You decide what's good for me for my health. You decide what's good for me for my political views and my ideology. And everything is just handed off to somebody else to manage for me. And it begs the question, like, well, who the fuck are you if you've delegated and handed everything off? And I think a lot of people in Bitcoin are starting to appreciate that once you can bring one of those, and perhaps one of the most important, back under your control, as you said, like, okay, now no custodian can shut me off. No government can confiscate my wealth, either, through inflation or directly. Like, I have such a high degree of sovereignty over the thing that most allows me to move through the world now. Wow. That's almost intoxicating. Like, that feels so good. Absolutely. There's a responsibility there, of course, but even taking that, like, even forcing myself to take responsibility for it feels really good. That feels like an accomplishment in a certain sense. It's like, okay, where else wasn't I doing that? And where else might I be able to do that? And will there be a similar benefit, like a viscerally felt benefit? And I think a lot of us are saying, like, in most places, the fiat system and culture and how it's developed generally has probably caused us to abdicate far more responsibility than we ought to have done. And this nexus of financial sovereignty is now bleeding out into other areas where we're wanting to say, you know what, I'm not comfortable being at the behest of fill in the blank. I want to be in greater control of that, and I want to be the one making decisions for myself. Notwithstanding, no one is ever going to know everything, right? So there has to be some degree of trust, but I think we're now finding a much better equilibrium, and the result of that is this sense of psychological stability, for lack of a better term, this sense of empowerment, this sense of like, wow, I'm way more in control of my life, and by virtue of that, I'm, to answer the rhetorical question I posed a second ago, I know way more who I am now, because I've actually constructed the constituent components of who I am, rather than just letting kind of the inertia of the culture pluck off with, whichever ones I make available and determine for me. And as a result, pretty much construct my mindset and my ideology and my orientation in the world. And so it's liberating on many different levels. And, I think a lot of us are starting to, want more of that, because again, I think it is an intoxicating feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a crucial first step in developing your own identity, for who you are. And like you said, empowering that you can make these decisions, and you can understand these concepts and work as your own, in your own best interest and as your own advocate for these things, instead of just outsourcing everything. Yeah, that's absolutely true. You think people would be primed to understand Bitcoin after, how difficult it has been over the last 2 decades to invest successfully, and all the monetary chaos and economic chaos that's happened. But it's still really difficult to orange pill people.
Yeah.
It's not, you think people would be primed, but they're just, it's very challenging. I mean, it has to happen in baby steps.
Totally.
And I still haven't quite figured that out. I mean, I've been selling financial ideas most of my career, and I'm comfortable talking with people about these, these things, and kind of meeting them where they are, understanding their mindset, and then trying to back into different ideas that might make sense for them, and getting them to understand that. And it's always a challenge, but Bitcoin is as big a challenge as any other, and maybe just simply because it's an unconventional approach, and people are wary of what's not convention. But yeah, I find it very challenging. Even people in my, my close sphere, I've had challenges orange pilling them, and I've kind of come to the strategy of, I think to some degree, just getting them to start investing, start DCAing. I think that in and of itself is kind of a good first step, because the assumption there being that if they have some skin in the game, they'll be more likely to pick up clues along the way and start building their own thesis there.
Totally.
But
I think skin in the game always helps. You pay attention more. But I think part of the reason why it's such a big ask is because it really is a paradigm shift, as we've been discussing. I mean, if the money is so influential in generating the institutions, and as a result of that, in inculcating certain mindsets, and as a result of that, effectively creating certain people. I mean, that's kind of the thesis that we just laid out, right? And so if that's the case, like all the signals that people have been getting their whole life, many of which have been implicit, non-obvious, have been coming from that paradigm. And we're basically saying, like, we're swapping out the very basis of the paradigm. And of course, it's going to seem odd or dangerous, or they're going to be fearful, or it's not going to seem real, because you're swapping out, perhaps the most influential or fundamental thing that you can swap out. And that means, like, it's almost like every signal that Bitcoin represents is going to seem antithetical to the ones that they're used to integrating, and the ones that they're used to responding to, and the ones that they've become accustomed to and conditioned by. And so, I totally get it. And I don't orange pill hard at all anymore. If anything, I deflect, and, it kind of has the benefit of that reverse psychology sort of thing, right? Like, I'm super into Bitcoin, but I don't know if you'd be into it. You probably wouldn't be, but I think at a minimum,
I agree.
What's happening now is, two things. The fact that there now is a legitimate alternative is just inevitably, and this is what we've seen, going to cause people just to say, oh, like, because when there's not an alternative, as we said before, what's even the point of asking the question? It's like,
Yeah.
I just have to learn how to play the game as it's presented because it's the only game in town. But
Yeah.
if another game is available, well, then I at least have to be like, is this the best game? Or what are the differences between the game? And that little splinter in your mind, for anyone who's at all curious or inquisitive or thoughtful or has the time to consider such things, I think eventually, you wind up seeing what the differences are. And this is a really interesting point about Bitcoin. It's like, does it not have certain virtues at its core, which is why when you play that game out of its like the fundamental comparative analysis, let's say, so many people end up choosing Bitcoin because it has fairness at its core. It has truth at its core. Whereas the thing that they're comparing it to has a lot of opaqueness, has a seemingly unfair hierarchy, treats people differently, has lots of exclusions and inclusions and all this kind of stuff. And it's so easy to favor the latter if you give it a fair and proper treatment, which again, many people don't, because as we said, your perspective is sacrosanct for many people. I mean, your perspective is how you see yourself through the chaos of the world. And whenever we get our perspectives challenged, typically speaking, whether it be in the realm of politics or health or whatever ideology, like people often push back aggressively because there's a inherent recognition that like what you're protecting is how you see the world, and how you see the world is how you move through the world. And it's also how you see yourself. And so that's what's being attacked effectively when you're asking people to consider this other thing. And so you can appreciate why there's a resistance to it. But for those people that have the courage, the openness, the curiosity to actually do so, it seems to me to be like it's increasingly hard to discount the validity of this new thing in Bitcoin. And which is why like it's kind of a one-way street, right? Of course, there's speculators and people think they're going to get rich quick, but over time there's more hodlers, right? It just keeps creeping up because people come in and they decide, I'm not going back to the old thing. I might keep a foot in there, right, to manage my life or whatever, but I'm moving more into this system because it's more virtuous and it gives me more peace of mind and it gives me more options for my life and it connects me with, people that I want to be connected with. And it's having some weird effect on my systems of value. And it's causing me to have experienced these internal changes, which are weird, but also really great. So more of that. And I actually think that like the people and the culture that it ends up producing is far more convincing than dropping like a monetary history lesson on your fucking aunt or something, right? Like what she probably ain't interested in that, right? But if she looks at a culture that or people that have strong families and strong relationships and they're happy, enthusiastic, energized, dedicated to a certain cause, well, like that, everyone kind of picks up their eyebrow about that. And you're like, what the fuck is going on with that person over there? And I think that's the more compelling pitch these days. I mean, it doesn't help you because you're more parameterized in a strictly financial sense when you're dealing with clients. But I think the fruits are an easier sell than the mechanics of what's going on,
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think as most people in the Bitcoin community are way more invested in the success of the Bitcoin ecosystem than in the price of coins. In a lot of ways, it feels like you're investing in something that's like a nonprofit charitable, organization that's doing good around the world and is helping benefit, millions of people. And you're invested in the success of that. Much more so than invested in, the number go up technology.
Totally. It's the most like positive something there ever could be, if we're right about this thesis, then like putting your financial and human capital behind it for the positive impact it could have on people all over the world, and that the good could accrue to yourself simultaneously. It's like, how could you think of a better win-win situation?
Yeah. It also, I was also thinking the other day that it's possible that we're not really hardwired to think that much about money, because historically money has been something that society has settled on at a high level and has been passed down for generations, and people haven't had to reinvent the wheel every generation and come up with a whole new money. I mean, that's really an unusual thing for humans to have to do.
Yeah.
And so maybe we're just not super equipped to, to make this kind of, I guess it's sort of like Gresham's law. It's gonna, good money's gonna chase out bad money, and then good money's gonna stay. For a successful society, typically its success is a byproduct of the soundness of the money that they're using. So I don't know. I thought that was an interesting idea that maybe that somewhat explains why people have such a hard time even considering, a new monetary system or the benefits we might derive from a new monetary system.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's definitely, as far as individuals being able to experience it, it's definitely a historically rare occurrence, right?
Yeah.
Like if the monetization of gold, whenever that happened in earnest, and then you have like the monetization of whatever forms of money were in smaller societies, and then maybe you want to throw in like the introduction of fiat or Bretton Woods in there, but the human beings have not, to your point, had to consider what money is very much, because most humans were born into a monetary paradigm that was as it was when they were born, and when they died, it was the same, and it was relatively unchanged, So it's a good point that we're not equipped for it. And perhaps as a result of that, and how kind of little we know about each or many of those occurrences, they don't wind up in textbooks either, right? Because like a lot of Bitcoiners would often say, well, they don't teach monetary history in school for a reason, nudge, nudge, the fucks at the Federal Reserve don't want people knowing about that shit. And that may be true, but you could also see a more innocent explanation, which is like, it's just not, maybe it doesn't seem that relevant. It wasn't a very like obvious historical event, like Alexander fucking right into Persia. Well, that was a very obvious historical event, and the impacts and the implications would probably be easy to elucidate. But like, where do you pinpoint the emergence of gold as a medium of exchange, right? Like, I think the first coinage was in Lydia or something like that. But like, when did people? We don't have any real information of when people's minds just shifted to gold being money versus, a complex barter system or debt system or what have you. So for those reasons, that might contribute to why it's not explored much in formal education.
Yeah. I think that the question of what is good money is a question that we should all be asking ourselves and talking about. And I think you can hem and haw debate whether Bitcoin is, an ideal investment for any one individual, or, what the future of Bitcoin might look like. But one thing I don't think you can debate is that Bitcoin is the best form of money ever created. I mean, that seems pretty inarguable when you look at what constitutes sound money, what the other contenders are for money, and you compare it to Bitcoin. It's just objectively the best form of money ever created.
I mean, I totally agree with you, but I'm sure you've seen the think boys and academics at Cato Institute and Aspen Institute and all these, supposedly like the leading economic minds of our time. And so many of them have a problem with that statement.
Is that right? Yeah. I'd like to hear what that argument is. I mean,
well, oftentimes it's like you need some inflation, right? If you don't have any inflation, you're not going to get economic growth. You need the capacity to be able to expand the money supply for unknown, surprising emergency circumstances, and they just, that betrays such a fundamental misunderstanding of what the role of money actually is. Yeah.
And because it's impossible, if you have that feature, it's impossible to not use that feature. I mean, if you can expand the money supply, you will expand the money supply. And there's no point at which you're going to stop doing that. So inevitably you're going to end up in the same place.
Absolutely. I mean, you inject just horrible incentives, and those incentives will work on people, and you'll get the corruption that they invite eventually. But also just the notion that like money is meant to synthesize all the happenings in the market into the optimal harmony, right? And so if there's an earthquake in Chile and the price of copper is affected as a result of that, you don't want to step in and be like, shit, print a bunch of money so that we obfuscate that or iron it out. You want the market to be able to signal the reality of what's happening. And it can only do that insofar as you have a mechanism that can't have other information introduced to it by other means. The information that the money is carrying is, oh fuck, that mine in Chile got destroyed, and now the the price of copper has shot up, and that forces the equilibrium to be found as efficiently and as quickly as possible. If you just think like, oh, let's pump a bunch of money into the system to try to make it better, you inhibit that process. You actually end up not finding the equilibrium, or finding it more slowly, or creating a perversion of the optimal harmony, which of course I would argue is what we have today. There's been so much misallocation of capital that we're in a world that we think is like, normal. This is kind of how it's supposed to be. Yeah, there's problems, but like, I think we're in a world that is a very, could possibly be a very substantial departure in terms of the institutions, in terms of how we define progress and wealth, and the products and services that are created in this culture are probably a far departure from what they could or would or should be if the monetary mechanism was not able to be corrupted in that way, and as a result was able to more efficiently and effectively determine proper harmony, and then allow market actors to determine value within that harmony. I think we would see, and we probably are going to see as a result of Bitcoin, a fairly different world on the surface, and beneath the surface. But I think things will look quite different.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, we need sound money to make sound decisions, and to stay. I sort of feel like we've departed from our evolutionary track, and using sound money it's far more likely to keep us on our evolutionary track. If we can print money and print, to solve any problem that comes up, we're derailing ourselves. We're not evolving. We're going backwards, basically. And obviously it does potentially mean, bigger recessions and, harder times from time to time, but we're going to emerge stronger from those and better equipped to deal with the next time. And with the tailwind of technology on our side, humanity just has so much upside.
I don't know if you would get bigger recessions and business cycles and stuff like that, because you take out the manipulation that puts more gas on the fire when it's burning. Then I think you take out a certain degree of volatility, when the fire is put out, and people suffer from that as well. Like I think that mid-level of stability is maintained far more resiliently, absent, the capacity to print money. Because again, like we say print money solves problems, but we all know that it doesn't. It shifts them elsewhere. And that makes them far more dangerous, because now they're outside of our awareness, and now they're outside of our capability to make decisions in recognition of their existence, and so now we're lacking that information rather than having it integrated and coordinating on that basis. So like, I think that's just a false Keynesian premise that people think like, oh, we soften things. And that was, kind of the premise of the introduction of the Federal Reserve, right? Like, oh, we need to iron out the business cycle. And everyone's like, of course, look at all these crazy crashes we've had. And, and there's a multitude of reasons why those crashes occurred. And the analysis was probably, one, overly simplistic, and two, in favor of the interests that wanted to establish the bank. But, all that being said, I think we'd have more stability and more stable growth, and we wouldn't see such dramatic fluctuations in the business cycle or investment cycles, because the capacity to misallocate capital, and as a result to destroy capital, would be much more restrained.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're moving from, small recessions that you can recover from. It gives you'll still recover from these recessions, but by kicking the can down the road, we're leading ourselves towards a recession that we may not be able to recover from, that there may not be, solutions to. We've just rolled these problems up into one bigger problem that's continues to lurk just outside the closet where we're hiding, essentially. Yeah.
And then you turn small risk. I mean, this is kind of the forest fire analogy, basically, but you turn small risk into existential risk, right? So you're always going to have risk. And as you say, I think Bitcoin does retether or reground our actions to reality, right? It makes our actions, if not more consequential, because again, we're always suffering the consequences, but we're far more, we see the causal link between our actions and what happens, right? Between cause and effect. Whereas the fiat system obfuscates that. And as a result, we're in a way worse position to determine what it is about our actions that have caused the effects that
Exactly.
we observe in the world. And I think
Yeah.
Bitcoin will bring us back into a position where we're much more able to see clearly that causal link, and that will be
Yeah.
very good. And as a result, we won't be building up all these hidden risks and potentially combining them into an existential risk, but they'll be smaller, manageable, easier to deal with and to transcend and to move forward. And this is the big risk, right? Like, what about our current situation as, human beings in the 21st century? What existential risks are we suffering from that have been caused by that obfuscation? And, nuclear war, or issues with the climate, or issues with environmental degradation, or political issues, violence of various kinds. Like, how many of those have been turned from manageable risk to existential as a result of this obfuscation of cause and effect due to the money?
Yeah.
And I would
Yeah.
say probably a good amount of it.
Absolutely. I think it's the core issue for wealth disparity, climate change, run amok government. I mean, the biggest problems we're facing are, from my perspective, all a byproduct of our monetary policy. And again, it's just so clear as a Bitcoiner, once you grok this, everything else makes sense. It's just mind blowing. And, my shirt is, not progressive, not liberal, not conservative. I'm a Bitcoiner now. You're able to see the world through a completely different lens. When, pre-Bitcoin, I was probably a lot more radicalized politically, feeling, like one party or the other was going to save us. And there's just nothing in our history that suggests that that's true. I mean, it's amazing that we all continue to, or that so many of us continue to believe that construct, because regardless of how well-intentioned you are, the political system we have doesn't work. It just makes the problems bigger, and it's not the solution. So there has to be something else, there has to be another lever that we can pull to fix the problems that we face. And that lever is Bitcoin. I don't know what other option there is.
I mean, of course I agree. And it's so, I think a lot of us have experienced this too, right? Like this, I mean, it's hard to find the words to articulate what you would call such a mechanism, but the understanding, or the truth, if we want to call it that, which elucidates the greatest amount of truth as a result of using it as a lens, let's say. Like, what do we call such a thing that allows so many of the pieces to fit together if this is kind of the basis on which you're observing or assessing or contemplating or reasoning about things? It's really tremendous. And I think many of us have felt that. And this is why we want to pursue it further, because that clarity is very, well, to use the term again, intoxicating, or seems beneficial, or, I mean, that's part of the allure of truth generally. I think, like, it helps lock things, click into place, right? You get that integrated perspective rather than a chaotic or dispersed or even delusional perspective. And I would say that a lot of us would probably admit in various ways. I mean, you just mentioned about politics, that we were deluded in a certain sense from the vantage point that we're in now. We would look back and say, oh, like, I can't believe I was stuck in that paradigm, and thinking that paradigm was the one that was going to determine, the most important outcomes, or the things that were most meaningful to me. And, this is why many of us refer to our fiat selves, right? Like, you as your shirt says, like, now that you're a Bitcoiner, you can look back and look at all the different ways that you saw the world without that mechanism or lens. And it seems like such a departure, and it seems like such a movement toward greater clarity or greater truth.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. I mean, I love engaging with people and talking and starting conversations and letting them, you get into conversations and people start griping about this aspect or that aspect of the world. And you can hear what they're saying, and essentially what they're talking about is Bitcoin, and they just don't know it. Like, so often they're talking about these problems or these things that they perceive in the world that they don't agree with. And they're just like scratching their head. They're like, gee, I wonder what the solution to any of this could be. And it's so obvious from our perspective that these things all boil down to a really poor monetary policy and platform that we all operate on. It's the root of really all of our problems from my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, of course. And when
I just
people
wish it
say,
was easier to get people to see that.
well, I mean, with every passing day, there's more podcasts, more books, more articles, more
Yeah.
everything, and there's so much more.
Yeah.
Well, as more people come in, there's so much more creativity, right? And people are expressing what they think is meaningful about this thing in a variety of ways, and that appeals to more and more people. And so, all things considered, because we're only 13 years into this, I think things are proceeding extremely rapidly, and it's hard to imagine them having gone better, at least to a point. I mean, this is happening. It's real. It's survived. It's changing people's lives. It's giving people a way to opt out of the madness, as you say. Like all these people that are they're right to feel the angst and the anxiety and the anguish that this system is inducing in them, right? That is, I think, as we've explored, like that's valid, but the options for responses are almost all poor options, or have been, right? Like the partisan politics, or the behaviors the destructive behaviors, the angry sentiments, like all this kind of stuff, the desire or the ideology that, like, oh, it's just the bad people have the power. We just need to put good people in power and everything will be solved. Like all that are bad options. And it's just a matter of time before people see an option where it ticks all the boxes, right? It's a choice that you can make. You don't have to convince anyone else to make it. You make it. It's for you. And you can establish greater sovereignty in your life, and potentially even greater meaning and greater relationships and greater health and all that other stuff. And then your options expand dramatically. And then you're able to opt out with far less risk. You're not as beholden. You're not as dependent. So who cares what happens in that space? I'm not saying that you can ignore it entirely, because we're still very integrated societies and cultures, but the more sovereignty and independence you take for yourself, the more options you give yourself. And then that calmness that we were referring to before starts to dawn on you. Like, wow, I don't have to be so invested or angry or insistent that this is the way things have to be and this is right. And like, I can actually make those decisions for myself and let my, build a more integrated world of and for me, and all those other people that are doing some in a similar way is doing the same thing in a similar way. And no convincing necessary, no arguments necessary. You do it for yourself. And that's why I think the culture, if I can call it that, has such a like weird, wonderful, wacky, rambunctious, like intense sort of pastiche to it, right? Because it's kind of combining all that. But I think what underlies it the most is a sense of freedom and almost the humor that comes from that. Because when you truly feel free, or at least to the degree you do, and hopefully it's increasing, you can laugh at things instead of cry at them, or you can laugh at things instead of yell at them. You can look at, whatever is happening on the news channel and just be like, and again, I'm not saying we're completely detached, but you can look and be like, holy fuck, that's insane. Like, I can't believe that's happening. Thank God I have insulated myself, to the extent that I have. And so, the connection there between freedom and humor, and the degree to which humor has kind of emerged in spirituality generally in the past, I think is that's partially for that reason, because you can be more lighthearted about things when you know that your freedom and your sovereignty and your own agency is not at risk. You've secured more of it for yourself. And so they can talk about whatever they want. They can argue about whatever they want. They're not going to penetrate the core of my freedom. Yeah.
And I mean, people, lots of organizations have talked about the importance of having a higher power. And that's not necessarily easy to come by. Some people have faith and religion, and, some people don't. And if you don't, I don't know how you acquire it. But Bitcoin to me is, in a lot of ways, the higher power that you can believe in and trust in and build an identity around, I guess. There seems to be a lot of quasi-religious overtones to Bitcoin and to the ecosystem in general. That peace of mind, like you're talking about, alone is quasi-religious. the ability to see the world through a different lens and to have the world make a lot more sense, and kind of restore your faith in humanity and your fellow man, and maybe more clearly identify that, you know, your fellow man may not be flawed so much as just misguided in certain ways or unaware of, you know, certain realities. Yeah, it's incredibly hopeful.
Yeah, to save you both from yourself and from the chaos of the circumstance you find yourself in, right? I mean, that's, again, as you say, I mean, there's so many parallels, and the use of language is, there's so many similar uses of language in both domains. And of course, a lot of people are critical of that, but I think I'm less critical of it, and I'm intrigued by it because I don't think it's intentional. You know, it's not like people are trying to force this into being more meaningful than it is. Rather, they're interacting with it and they're learning about it, and they're sensing and feeling the impacts that it's having. And the only words that they can find to properly communicate or contextualize what's happening is found in the theological or religious domain. Right. And so one of my big things is like, why, what do we do with that? What does that mean? You know, like, try as we might to not overdo it and not overcommit unnecessarily. And I think many of us do have that kind of attitude towards it. You can't deny the feelings that it's making you feel, and the what it's permitting in your life. And when your mind struggles to find the words for how to communicate that, the only parallels that are to be found are in those domains that were previously under the religious, you know, rubric. And so, and I think that was part of what you mentioned in your original tweet to me, right? Like, it's, you're kind of on board with the notion that there's something deeper happening here. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how you, I mean, and it's not something I spend a lot of time thinking about, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least if this was alien technology that was dropped off to us. You know, I mean, religion is an amazing thing and incredibly beneficial for a lot of people. But even, you know, religion doesn't have the ability to do what Bitcoin does. I mean, Bitcoin has the ability to change incentives and change the efficiency of businesses and to change communities and to make people act in a more responsible and productive way. I mean, it has these very real connection to the real world. And then you factor in the mining component and the ability of it to address one of the biggest problems we face with climate change, potentially. It seems otherworldly. It's amazing to me that the monetary technology by itself is so profound. And then you start thinking about the implications of the mining industry, which are completely unrelated and disconnected items that both have the ability to make profound change in the world for completely different reasons. That's a technological revolution that's never happened before. And it's just mind-blowing. Totally. And I mean, if we pursue the line of thinking or continue the line of thinking where perhaps one of the attributes or way to identify or define truth is like, truth is that which allows the constituent components of a system or reality to click together, right? To work, to harmonize optimally. Then, you know, you look at this thing, and as you say, I mean, it's got pristine attributes for the function of money, but perhaps by virtue of that and how it delivers that, how it brings together the components of our real world to deliver that, it necessarily has to, you know, or maybe not necessarily, but it seems to be the case that it's clicking other pieces together as well. By virtue of perhaps that profound truth, it's going out into other domains, or people are applying it to other domains and saying, wow, it has a revolutionary effect here as well, and here as well, and here as well. And all, you know, you could characterize that as just locking different constituent components that we interact with, components of our culture, systems, reality itself, locking them into a cohesive, like into their proper place almost, or what seems to be their proper place. And again, I mean, that's another like, well, what do you do with that? Because that's a pretty pretty fucking profound notion. And
Yeah.
I think the religious crowd would take issue with your characterization of like Bitcoin is more real, right? Because it's kind of tautological. Like the greatest truth, the most real thing is fill in the blank, their whatever their system of faith dictates, right? Whether it's God or Jesus or Buddha or Tao or what have you. So like I think definitionally they probably push back on that. But it seems, and you might say like if every single person acted in accordance with the fundamental tenets of the faith, right? If every single person did their best to emulate Christ, then maybe we would have a system where there was no lying and there was no need for trust and everything just worked perfectly because everyone was so pure internally. But in advance of that, perhaps where, people don't act that way, certainly having a system that forces you to act in that way if you're going to avail of it, right? You cannot be a dishonest actor if you're going to avail of the advantages of the system. If you're going to be a user of the system, then it's like it allows you to act as if in advance of becoming, in effect. And again, like that's really profound as well, because it's a mechanism for inculcating the principles that we've already established are the highest, most virtuous, like, the best way to be effectively. We now seem to have developed a technology that's actually instilling that in people by virtue of the benefits that it provides. Right. So it's like, it's literally a quasi Christ or a spiritual mechanism that's just signaling those virtues into people as a result of their use of it. And it's like, that's pretty crazy.
It is. It's profound. And we get, a front row seat to watch this thing evolve. I feel, I guess, hopeful and maybe lucky to have a front row seat. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think it's crazy that, even to the point of a new money emerging, even if it wasn't Bitcoin, but like, let's say we were around however many thousands of years ago when they shifted to gold. Even that would have been kind of cool, because now we have a way better monetary medium, and that would have caused a lot of different flourishing in many different aspects. But certainly here now with Bitcoin, whatever, you see these memes from time to time, like, too old to have lived during X period, too young to have lived during Y period, just in the middle where it was boring or it was shitty or nothing was happening. If you ever felt that way, once you get into Bitcoin, that just washes away, because I can't think of a more insane or profound or epic period of time to exist in than this one. And I think for better or for worse, we're going to be the crew that's called upon and looked back on as, how did you guys see through the early days? Because this is the icky part. This is the part where one system is being torn out and from another, and by virtue of how ingrained and how influential it is, that's gonna, it may be, I don't want to be certain about this, but it may be an ugly process, and how we all handle that is probably going to be, we're probably going to be judged on that in the future. So I think it's important, this kind of character development that Bitcoin instills, that we engage in that consciously and we apply it to however we choose to interact with Bitcoin and other people who are doing the same, because it might be more consequential than we might allow ourselves to think.
Yeah. If it's not an ugly process, it's going to be because Bitcoin has this amazing ability to sort of get in the seams and in the cracks of government and institutions and business, and subtly, slowly change incentives of individuals and then incentives of organizations. And I wouldn't underestimate Bitcoin's ability to fix even the most broken institutions we have and we rely on over time. And it's such a profound truth. Obviously it's still such a young technology that we're just seeing this, we're just seeing the momentum starting to build. But it just represents such a profoundly more truthful path forward for humanity. And I feel like at some point it's just going to start clicking for people, and it's going to force its way. It gives me hope for sure that even, government can be fixed. Even though it's broken, it looks to be broken beyond repair at this point, but I'm still hopeful that that Bitcoin will help change incentives and fix a lot of what's broken in government.
I agree. I think it will take a very different form than it does right now.
Yeah,
because it's
government has to
allowed,
shrink
yeah, dramatically, right? Because it doesn't have
dramatically.
a magic money printer to just pay everyone.
Yeah,
And I think who knows, right? Like anyone who's speculating, whether you're an anarchist or a, anarcho-capitalist or whatever, like I think it's way too early to tell how it's going to take shape. Like we will want to coordinate and cooperate with one another, and we'll want to mitigate, violence and violation of property and that kind of stuff. And Bitcoin is like it's going to dramatically, because so much of the value and wealth in society, I think, is going to funnel into the most protectable and most usable property, and that is money, that is Bitcoin. And so like, all that monetary premium is going to come off a lot of stuff. So there's going to be less to protect, but it doesn't mean no value is going to exist ex Bitcoin. And there will have to be, social arrangement agreements and stuff like that to manage, the quote unquote monopoly on violence. And so I don't know exactly what shape it's going to take. Governance will almost certainly exist in some form because but a massive reduction in the size that we currently see, and good, as far as I'm concerned, like
for sure,
shrink that bitch down as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, completely agree.
What do you wear that shirt that you have on around friends and stuff? And if so, what are the responses you get?
Well, somewhat muted. I mean, I wear it because I want to engage in the conversation, but to some degree, I completely agree with, your reverse psychology perspective of trying to downplay it, not leading with Bitcoin. I love the people. Well, for one, I want to identify people in my community who are like-minded, which is not easy to do. So I think I wear the shirt trying to get comments from other people who might be like-minded, but then just to start the conversation. And and it's a question that comes up with my clients too, often because I initiate the conversation. And when I do that, I do it knowing that there's some professional risk I'm taking by bringing this up. I think a lot of people, if their advisor is recommending they buy Bitcoin, may walk away with the concept that their advisors lost their mind. I mean, there's 99% of clients out there are not going to understand. Maybe I'm overestimating, but it's a large percentage. So there is some risk, but I'm confident in the way I can explain it. I think it's a hedge that it's just a prudent thing to invest in, because it's a hedge against, it's cheap insurance. It's a hedge against all the things that might go wrong in the fiat world. So adding 2 to 5% of your liquid net worth in Bitcoin is just a prudent thing to do from my perspective. So it can be a tough conversation to have, but I'm obviously believe deeply that this is very important, and anything I can do to, help the adoption of Bitcoin, I want to do, and anything I can do to help my clients, navigate the next 10, 20, 30 years, I want to do. And baby stepping into Bitcoin is a great first step. Totally. Just having the conversation. I assume that you have to baby step into these things. You have to have this conversation over weeks or months or years before people really understand it. I mean, I know I've always been a gold bug, and I heard about Bitcoin in probably 2017 or 2018 and just ignored it. And I don't know why in 2020, I finally was ready to accept Bitcoin. I don't know what tips the scale there, but
Sailor.
It was Sailor. Yeah, I think it was Sailor and Breedlove, and maybe Sailor on CNBC. I don't really know. I just decided to buy it at some point in 2020, and then once I bought it, I started listening to podcasts and getting more involved with Twitter, and everything started falling in place. But it was a long process. And I just think it's not something you can force on people. You have to just, you have to keep dripping on them like you do with a lot of ideas. It takes time, and they need to come to it on their own terms. Hopefully it's like,
sorry,
I was just gonna say, hopefully it's like bankruptcy. It's gradually, then suddenly people will come to terms with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think necessity is ratcheting up, and that's going to be a very big motivator for a lot of people, probably before too long. I mean, you could even make a strong case it's a bit late in the game for not to be aware of the necessity for it. But do you have any of your clients turned into like super orange pilled, and like your like quarterly portfolio meetings or whatever just come in to turn into like geeking out about Bitcoin, or none of them are like super, none of them are wearing a t-shirt yet?
No, none of them are. But I have clients who are doing it, and they trust me, and they we're still talking about relatively small parts of their total portfolio, and I think that's where most people should start. Unless you have complete conviction yourself, even if you don't understand Bitcoin, the correct amount of exposure to Bitcoin is not zero. Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean you shouldn't have any exposure to it.
Right.
I think it's absolutely just constitutes prudent money management. And if your advisor, whatever advisor you're using, doesn't understand Bitcoin, you have to wonder what else they don't understand. I'm not sure that they've done their research.
That's an extremely good point. Yeah, extremely good. And, in a sense, it kind of reveals what the whole racket is about. I mean, not the whole racket. I certainly don't want to disparage like the good actors in it. But as we said at the beginning, like, my experience was you go in thinking like you're going to bring to bear all of your insight and knowledge to try to really construct like a just whiteboard out like the best possible solution for the client. But you get funneled into a very narrow scope. And then, the research department is giving you your talking points, and you're watching, CNBC for a couple of more. And, for a lot of people, if not all, like that's kind of it. Right. And so if Bitcoin isn't in that mix, right, if it's not in your research email from the company, and if it's not, being talked about favorably from your favorite pundit, you're going to dismiss it, and you're not going to be involved in it. And I agree that I think it should be a red flag. It's like, this is, whether you agree with it or not, it's a legitimate phenomenon in the world today. It's a $500+ billion asset. It's traded 24/7, 365. You can use it or exchange it in various capacities nearly all over the world. Why don't you have an opinion on it? I want an informed opinion on it,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I mean, it's even worse than that. I mean, my broker dealer, which is a fairly large broker dealer, doesn't have any mechanism by which we can easily trade Bitcoin. We have an alternative investments department that focuses on lots of different alternative investments, and I've tried to orange pill them. I've tried to talk to them about it. I sent them the Ross Stevens interview with Michael Saylor. Ross Stevens runs the largest institutional platform for alternative investments in the world. This
Really?
is a guy who. Yeah, I mean,
I didn't know it was that big.
Yeah, it's very large, and he's been, obviously he and Michael Saylor have both been extremely successful parts of the legacy financial system. And Bitcoin, here's Bitcoin, the number one performing asset over the last 13 years. That's getting endorsed by people like Michael Saylor and Ross Stevens, and my broker dealer is still not willing to essentially consider it. They're not, as far as I know, they're not even doing their due diligence on it. So you don't really have any options. So when I work with clients, I just essentially refer them to Swan, which I think is probably the right way to go anyways. But it's just amazing to me that you would think that if for no other reason, the number one performing asset over the last 3 years would attract some eyeballs in the financial management space, but they have these biases and this reluctance to entertain the concept. I can't explain why that is, but it's a frustrating part of it for sure.
Yeah. And I suspect, I mean, that's going to change at some point. It's just weird that it hasn't changed sooner. But as you said, I mean, I think referring them to Swan probably is the better choice anyways. But, you know, you may not get anything financially from it, but one, I think you build trust with the client and say, oh, look, he's recommending to me someone outside of his, his world because he thinks it's what's best for me. And I think it is what's best for them because, you know, I'm a big critic of paper Bitcoin. You know, I think the whole value of the asset is what we were describing earlier, like that you actually own it. And I know like not everyone's ready for that and that kind of stuff, but it's less of a hurdle than most people think it is. And it's made like, it's kind of a mountain made out of a molehill by people just saying like, oh, no one's ever going to do that. So just give them the ETF. It's like, well, why don't you explain that, you know, a redundant 12 word set, you know, spread out in a couple different places means they can have 5% of their wealth in a manner that doesn't have custodial risk, that doesn't have bank holidays, that's not closed down on the weekends, that won't be shut off if you support the wrong protest or whatever. Like it's a small price to pay for all of those, for the value of all those attributes. So I actually think that it's kind of good that you're forced to go that route rather than having a ready-made paper solution. Just say, hey, get some exposure, because that's all it is, just exposure then.
Correct. Yeah, no, I agree. I just think it's unfortunate that, you know, that there's this reluctance to entertain these ideas that, you know, I honestly believe that we're doing our clients a disservice by not at least having an opinion on it and having some way, you know, especially if you have a retirement account, it's not easy to necessarily fund it and buy Bitcoin directly. It's a little more complicated. And I think you're doing clients a disservice if you're ignoring this asset class and not at least doing your research and coming to a conclusion about it. And then, you know, eventually you're going to lose clients over it. It's a bad business idea. It's not the right thing to do for clients. And it's just, you know, and I chalk all this up to the fact that it's new and, you know, especially these big institutions are slow to adopt, and, you know, they're probably going to be the last ones to adopt, which is fine, you know, as long as you're everyday into, exactly.
How do your colleagues think about your penchant for Bitcoin?
They're confused by it. I think they tolerate, you know, we talk about it, and I do my best to get them to see it from my perspective. There's some sympathetic, you know, conversation, and I think some of them are trying to understand, but for the most part, I have one colleague that I've worked. I mean, now I'm independent, so I don't really work. I spent 25 years with a large broker dealer and had lots of cohorts in my office, and and I'm still in contact with those guys, but almost none of those guys really understand Bitcoin except for one. And that's true of gold too. I mean, I was always an advocate of gold, and I think people kind of thought it was, you know, a little bit silly or didn't make a lot of sense and didn't really understand the allure of it, just because it's outside the spectrum of what they usually recommend and endorse and get paid on. Like you said, their incentives. Mm-hmm. You know, even good actors in the financial services field they're going to be influenced by their incentives, you know, even if they're, totally. There's no way to avoid that.
No.
So,
I mean, everyone is to some degree. I guess it's a spectrum of how much you subordinate your, what's the right word? Like your sense of what's most right to your incentives.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I mean, like, and still this is kind of the, like, I don't want to, everyone still is in charge of their decisions, right? So even as crazy as the fiat system is, like, I don't think fundamentally it's an excuse for bad behavior, but I mean, it's just a reality that the more, like the optimal, well, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but just like the more the incentive is drawing you towards one behavior, the harder it is to resist that behavior, right? The more strength of character you need in order to resist it, the more virtuous you have to be in order to resist it. And, you know, and so that means that you're going to get less of that virtuous behavior if the incentives are counter to that, because that's what an incentive is. It's pulling you forward. It's making a particular behavior more likely. And so when the whole system is basically making those behaviors more likely.
Yeah.
It's not surprising that the behavior that's outside of that and the strength of those incentives, or even counter to those incentives, is not, people aren't, drawn to it in large numbers, initially, because it's just,
Yeah.
it's against their best interest, or at least their perceived best interest.
Yeah. I agree. It's that Upton Sinclair quote of, it's difficult to get a man to understand something if his employment depends on him not understanding it.
Yeah.
That's very true. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Josh, was there anything else you wanted to discuss or get off your chest or anything today before we shut it down? I know you got to go in about 9-10 minutes.
Yeah, no, it's a great pleasure speaking with you, and big fan of your show, and this has been wonderful. I'm very much appreciative.
Yeah, well, I've enjoyed it a lot too. I love hooking up with Bitcoiners out in the wild and hearing their stories, because it's so often, not many people live in with a lot of Bitcoiners around them, right? At this point in the story in this point in the story of Bitcoin, it's mostly isolated, sleeper cell Bitcoiners that are still acting normal out in the world, and it's great to connect with everyone and get their perspective and hear their stories and see what how they're trying to understand this thing for themselves and their own journey, but also, what they're doing in the world to advance the cause, let's say. So it's been a pleasure, man. I really appreciate the time, and we'll have to keep in touch and maybe do it again sometime.
Okay. Thanks, John.
All right, brother. Take care.
Have a good one.